as far as I can tell, I think we left off here. And what we've been following along with is just the process of growing up and using some of the concepts that Erik Erikson offers us and talking about development itself. We left off at the school age where the main task, life task that has to be developed or mastered, if you will, is initiative versus guilt. And in the crisis in this case ends up getting resolved or not, all right, in terms of what we refer to as fumbling and fear. There's a lot of opportunities for shame to begin to show up. And we talked about this in terms of this is stained glass 1.0. This is the beginning point of trying to take advantage of the cracks and fractures that have occurred over time and kind of use them to the kids' advantage. The kids at this point begin to realize how much power they have to impact other people, to present an appearance of some sort. One of the things we mentioned about this time is that it's all about obscuring vision. It is not about telling a tale or anything else. It's just making it so that I feel a little safer. So even in this growing together phase, it looks that way, and to some degree it is that way. Some of this hinges on the nature of what goes on in the family itself as well, and the kind of messages that are communicated. So where we go from here is continuing on, just to finish this one up, is what characteristics we begin to see is this created picture of what he's concluded others will accept. Which at this point, the thing I want to point out about this particular first version stained glass is there are still places that are clear. Things can still be seen through, but there is just enough there to obscure vision. And so the kiddo in this case seems to be clear about what he wants to do or she wants to do, so their judgment is clear, their ability to respond to other people is much more engaged because they've settled on a strategy that works each and every time. And they begin to settle in on this strategy really for safety and self-protection. And this is the beginning points of, okay, this is how life works. This is what I have to do to stay safe. I don't have, in some kids' instances, I don't have enough safe people to really help me stay safe, so I've got to figure it out for myself. And so there's the beginning points of the stained glass. At this point, they have now, what is now filling in the gaps between the pieces of glass is shame. Shame is the connective tissue of stained glass. It is the thing that holds everything together. The one thing we know about and we can use within the context of a stained glass is that the metal that is used to hold a stained glass together is extremely soft, but is also extremely impenetrable. Most of the time it's lead or something similar to that. So we have the beginnings of a stained glass. Where we go from here then is really the idea that Erikson was talking about was initiative versus guilt, and this initiative allows the kid to undertake things and get things done and be able to accomplish things according to what he or she really wants to accomplish. And what ends up happening is the stained glass begins to get applause. It begins to get approval. They begin to realize that they can actually manage the control of other people's perceptions of them. And that's what makes it so important. At this stage in the game, they begin to realize that indeed I can manage other people's conclusions about me. And that really requires a willing party, which is really what you see even within school age is, you know, I'll show you a nice image. If you show me your image, we'll believe that each of those images are the things that they are, and we'll all be happy and we'll all be fine. So guilt enters in when my initiative, the things that the child begins to accomplish, doesn't happen, and what then comes in is the guilt opens this door for what we've been talking about as shame. It's not because I've done something wrong, it is because I am wrong. It isn't because I've made a mistake, it's because I am a mistake. And there are a variety of messages in the child's environment that communicates that, not because the adults are trying to communicate that. Okay, just understand this. This happens to all of us. This isn't, I'm not trying to describe an environment that is fundamentally abusive or neglectful or anything like this. But because of the nature of being a child, when an adult says something to us as children, we personalize it because we haven't developed enough boundaries to know that they're not talking about my person. They're talking about my behavior. And no matter how hard parents say the right things, all right, no matter how hard they do that, kids are still going to personalize it. It's about who I am, not about what I do. Why do they do that? Because they're not cognitively developed enough to figure that out. It takes a certain level of cognitive development to actually get an understanding that behavior is not me. And I am not my behavior. I can choose, I can do something differently with the behavior I have. But it's at this point that we begin to figure out, and other people begin to figure out, that I can manage other people's perceptions. I have control over other people's perceptions. So we trade images, and we trade images with each other, and then we stay safe because we figure that's the easiest way to go about doing that. Now, what happens is we get to the tail end of the school age and we start going into what most everybody thinks is the most tumultuous part of that, and that thing called adolescence. The interesting thing about that is that adolescence is not nearly as tumultuous as most urban mythology would have us believe. The actual numbers of kids that go through adolescence that are rebellious and always having trouble and getting in trouble with authority and all the other kind of stereotypes we have is relatively small. That is not the trajectory of most adolescents. But what they begin to conclude, and this is the movement from school age to adolescence, okay? So the school age child, the school child, begins to conclude that who he is, who she is, what is important is, one, the color of their skin. Remember, we talked about properties and the nature of that person. Well, suddenly the school-age child is beginning to realize that it isn't necessarily the internal dimensions that they're being judged by, but the external ones. So the color of their skin is one example. The background of their parents would be another example. And finally, the last one really is the fashion of their clothes. Those things are all the things that will decide their worth. Sounds a lot like where we are, right? Social media has only amplified that message. My worth is determined by how I look, who I hang out with, what my family is like, how much money they have, and what social caste I'm in. And by the tail end of the school age period, kids are making that calculation. They're figuring this thing out. The thing that they realize is that, and the thing that they also conclude is that the qualities that determine their worth do not include his or her motivation and capacity to learn. The will to learn, the capacity to learn, is not the thing that is actually going to determine their worth. It's all those other things. So before too long, they begin to develop a more and more sophisticated stained glass. And as they move along in their development, the glass continues to fracture, and it gets more and more sophisticated and more obscuring. Because remember, just to refresh your memory a little bit, when I talked about stained glass, it accomplishes probably 2, maybe 3 different things. The first one is it tells a story. Secondly, it obscures the vision of everybody outside. And thirdly, the person inside remains protected. So we get into adolescence, and this is what we begin to see. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the conclusion continues to be one of shame is the way to stabilize this image. And before too long, the stained glass, part of the stained glass is to change that image and begin to craft an identity. So we move from something that keeps me safe to something that I am. And so we move, as the child moves through and into adolescence, they begin to realize the power that they have and the collusion that other people have with them. I'll trade my image for your image. And they conclude that actually they can fashion something other than what they are. This doesn't sound like today at all, right? Identity politics, identity period. It's really ironic that the APA moved from what we used to call as multiple personality disorder to dissociative identity disorder. It's part of the pantheon of I am who I say I am, not my biology, not anything else about me. It's who I say I am. And the roots of that is founded in this kind of material, this stuff that I'm talking about here. So where we land, now notice this stained glass and then look at this stained glass. And what differences do you see between those two? What differences do you see? Yeah, it's still clear. There's still some clear stuff in it. Anything else? Yeah.
This one has like so many different pieces and they're also intricate and they work together perfectly.
Yeah, they do. They do, yeah.
I mean, there's a cross, which could symbolize like using good behavior as your image.
Yeah, let me go back. There's where we started, and more fractures result in this. And the kid begins to realize, look, I've got all of these fractures. I can't stop it from being fractured. I might as well leverage it into something that I can use. And so they recognize this power, and they recognize also that if I rearrange these things in just the right way, I can create an appearance rather than a reality. Because the reality I've already condemned. I have parts of me that I've condemned. I have parts of me that I find acceptable, or at least other people do. So we move from the rudimentary pattern that I mentioned, that we showed you before, to a way more sophisticated one, and is far more targeted to the audience that is absorbing it. So everybody's stained glass is different. A lot of times our stained glass betrays who we are playing to, if you will. And also we have interchangeable ones depending on the groups that we're in. So it's gotten more sophisticated, more targeted, and it tells a story. The first one doesn't tell a story. Its only purpose is to obscure vision and to keep one safe. This one is clearly set up to be able to communicate something. So where we go from here is more fractures are occurring, but they're occurring not only from the outside, but also from the inside. Because now a new voice is added of condemnation. It's self-condemnation. And so more bits of glass to work with to develop a picture for everybody to see and appreciate. And the challenge is, and what's very interesting about this is that this is the front-facing stained glass. What's interesting is when you start to think about it, there are two different questions. One is, what's the stained glass that everybody sees? And then what is the stained glass that I see? Because I'm on the inside, and when I look at that stained glass, I see something very different than what people see that's front-facing. Yeah.
I feel like that too, like
Yeah.
Even though it might be like working in terms of like how people view us, with us, who we are,
Mm-hmm.
but we're still condemning with like very stained glass that is like bringing us acceptance.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. We love and hate it at the same time. It accomplishes something, and yet we know we're imprisoned by it. I mean, it's a little bit like a prison cell with a stained glass door. Yeah.
When you said another voice gets added, are you meaning at this time, particularly like when kids start to develop like a conscience and
Yeah, that self-consciousness
but
comes into play.
that sounds like self-condemnation.
Yeah.
You're more aware, but that's like part of it.
Yeah, the changes that occur. Because one of the biggest changes that occurs in thinking abilities from school age to adolescence is self-consciousness. So now they're spectating on themselves and making conclusions about what they see. So it's different. School age kids don't do as much of that. Now, I think it has to be said, depending on the environment the kid grows up, they may develop a certain level of hypervigilance, but that's not the same as self-consciousness. That's not the same. So, the narrative that you see here oftentimes takes on the person's first attempt at approval, and where do we start? We start with the people around us, their beliefs, their worldviews, those things that we believe they will find pleasing and acceptable. Now, like we said before, in the other kind of stained glass 1.0, and now we're at 2.0, is that there's a dark side to that too. Because in a lot of cases, somebody despairs of ever finding any approval, then their stained glass starts looking very different. As a matter of fact, it is a fight against the people that are outside me, and sometimes those are fashioned in such a way to say, I dare you to condemn this. I've already condemned it, but I dare you to condemn this. And so the backdrop to this oftentimes is a sense of conformity, and the irony is most people think they're being very individualistic while they conform, and more of their images look more and more alike. So during this time, when we're talking about kind of the tasks that have to be done, they are primarily concerned with what they appear or how they appear in the eyes of others. This is the beginning of appearance management. And they become more motivated to manage the appearance and the other people's perception than caring for what's going on inside behind the stained glass. So it's everything that they see is compared to what they feel they are and what they have concluded they are. And the interesting thing about adolescence is that most people would say that it is kind of a reworking. Erickson uses the word refighting a lot of the same tasks that have already preceded it. The autonomy, the initiative, the trust or mistrust, all of that. So the whole idea of appearance management is directly related to behavior management. If you want to get real religious, sin management. So we manage it to look like we are managing things rather than to be like that. And that really is the purpose behind a stained glass like this. So the primary life task here is something that Erickson refers to as ego identity. What it becomes is this accumulated confidence that the child has built up over the lifespan up until this point, and from the successes with the autonomy and with initiative and with trust development. All of those things come together during this time, and there's a certain level of confidence that's matched by how they're seen by the important people in their life. One of the phenomena we know exists for adolescents is something called the critical audience. And that's one of the reasons why when people head through adolescence, and some people are still there, that that they'll stand hours and hours and hours in front of the mirror trying to hide something just behind their hairline because they're sure everybody's seeing it. And that's the critical audience. It's guess who the audience is? The person. It's not the outside people. And we still have vestiges of it. You sit in a nice restaurant, they have a wonderfully, hardwood floor, and you clumsily knock your knife to the floor, and it clangs all over the place. And what do you want to do? Crawl under the table so everybody stops looking at you. Of course, everybody gives you about 1 millisecond of time and goes right on about their business. The critical audience lives on. And that's part of what we're talking about here when we look at ego identity. On the flip side of this, the crisis comes with what is often referred to as role confusion. And this description by Erik Erikson is really, you got to understand, this guy was writing this stuff in the 50s. And he's saying this: when role confusion begins to develop in adolescence, the kid over-identifies with heroes, cliques, or crowds. The heroes of the clique or the crowd. Doesn't sound like social media at all, right? Some of the biggest celebrities, that 1.2 million followers or whatever. It's a recognition or a attempt to bring oneself back together by identifying or even over-identifying with heroes, in whatever form they are. The other part of this role confusion is you see what can be referred to as kind of a clannishness. There is an in-group and there is an out-group. And that out-group is ruthlessly kept outside. And the in-group goes uncritically evaluated. This is what makes parents absolutely nuts. Because when kids begin to hang out with their friends that are really of questionable character, they don't question that, but they throw stones at the kids that probably have a better character. Because we have to keep the cognitive kind of consonants together. If I'm going to hang out with these people, they're going to be good people. If I'm not going to hang out with people, they're bad people. So we've got an all or nothing thing going on here that is really very much a part of this. But it is an indication of the role confusion. When I start feeling confused, I look for ways to bring organization to it. And one way to do that is to identify with somebody who looks like they've got their identity figured out. So I identify with them, thinking that I can kind of pull that in and begin to put the pieces of myself together. But unfortunately, those pieces of myself are held together by shame. So we're never addressing the core issue, which is about the shame that holds this thing together. I can look very pretty, but the very thing that holds that whole thing together is poisonous to me. So this is an extremely pivotal point in time because we're talking about compartmentalization and disintegration is the path to safety. See, conclusions are made and solidified into believing that really the only way to survive, because people are going to think what they're going to think. And if I can't change that, and now and again I'm reminded of the fact that I can't change it, what's the best thing for me to do? Withdraw, create an appearance of conformity, and stay safe. So safety is this primary motive that leads to appearance management, behavioral management, and you can just add in the sin management piece. There are a lot of Christians today that are devoted to sin management, never really believing grace. Because they don't believe grace will change them. The only thing that will change them is harder, faster, longer, deeper, better behavior management. And pointing themselves into and looking at their heart is a foreign language. So they forget, and this is the key, is they forget, by this time, they forget the fact that the stained glass is not them. They become it. it is a reflection of who they are. And that's the danger, of course. But it's easy to forget. So the thing that we have to talk about is if we're going to say that is beautiful, it is protective, I am safe behind it, but it's disintegrated. And a lot of people, myself included, live varying lives of integration or disintegration, depending on where we are and what things have happened and how we're functioning and managing things. But the thing to keep in mind is each compartment here has its own rules of engagement. It is suited for a particular situation, a particular people, a particular environment, and certain behaviors are expected and provided depending on which part I use, which compartment I use. So it lays in place a strategy for managing life without God in it. And that strategy becomes what I do. So each compartment has its own values. In terms of what is important, the basis for decisions are made about what's valuable, and each compartment has its own identity. So I have a compartment labeled school, and maybe school's too broad. I have a compartment that I use in the shame and grace class, and I have a compartment that I use in research methods. And I have a compartment that I use in church, or the compartment I use for talking to young life kids, or the compartment I use for talking to my parents. And each one has a set of values and beliefs and behaviors that we engage in, and it stands on its own 2 feet. So, this sets the stage for everything to follow from here on out. And the question that has to be asked is, how does one gauge in intimacy? It's fascinating when you look at Erikson's stages of development on the heels of ego identity versus role confusion. The next step is intimacy. And the way I define intimacy is knowing and being known. So how does one pursue intimacy, or how does one choose safety? You're not going to have, you can't have both. You can't have both. Intimacy always requires risk. It can't not. That's why Brené Brown makes that same point, is vulnerability is the basis for trust, and trust is the basis for vulnerability. Being able to bring things out into the open, because shame flourishes in darkness, and we've already established behind a stained glass, it's pretty dark in there. So when I bring it out into the open and talk about it, risk increases. Do I feel safe? No, I don't. But that feeling of unsafeness may be part of what chains us to staying behind the stained glass. So I have to begin to ask myself the questions about what are my core beliefs, what are my core attitudes and values that determine how I go about doing things and engaging in life. The thing that we have to understand is this presents one answer, and when you go into your heart, your heart presents a different answer. This is the one that manages and keeps people engaged. The other one threatens that, or at least we believe it threatens that. So, after adolescence, the path leads either to intimacy or isolation. And if one has continued to choose the path of development of the stained glass, there is a further commitment to safety, to control, to self-protection. And what you'll notice is, look what's happened to the stained glass. It's become more individualistic, but it's become even more detailed so that less and less can be seen. Yeah, Shelby.
How often can you change, like, the stained glass
How-
as we get older? Like,
How often?
Yeah, or how much room is there for change?
Well, I think once we get into a young adulthood, there's less and less change. There's more change happening, in the early stages of development, I think is safe to say. But we're going to talk about that in a minute as to what happens that could potentially change this. Do we change the stained glass? Yes. This is a static picture of something that's entirely fluid. It's moving all the time. We can change it according to need and demand of the people around us. But this stained glass would, people would gasp at the beauty of it and the sophistication of it, and that's exactly the point. So young adulthood is kind of the launching point. Adolescence sets the foundation for things to happen. All the preceding stages have kind of put things in place. Adolescence is when a lot of these decisions are made, and then it sets in place and things start to happen. A lot of times when you look at when people come to Christ, most of the time it's during this time, young adulthood. A lot of times, not during childhood. I mean, however many number of you that accepted Christ when you were little kids, and then had to rework it later. But a lot of the major kind of indicators would suggest people come to Christ during this period of time, because there's still the potential for change. There's still things that can change. So when we look at it, so if we go toward intimacy, we say there's got to be more than hiding behind a stained glass. We have to ask the question, well, how do I reverse the effects of the stained glass? And there are three different things that come in under a crisis. It's oftentimes during young adulthood that a crisis occurs. You might call it a faith crisis, spiritual crisis, whatever it might be. It might be an emotional one, a relational one that kind of changes everything just in one fell swoop because it falls apart or something doesn't go right or somebody loses a job thinking they're going to have it for the rest of their life, which is not even statistically true anymore. So there are three things that are needed in order to begin to reverse the effects of the stained glass self. The first one is discomfort. I'll start with the easiest one first. I begin to conclude that I don't like where I am. I don't like how I do things. It doesn't work real well. I have an idea of how things should be, and they're not. So I'm wrestling with this disappointment. There's a key point in time when disappointment either takes me back into shame, or I stand firm in the disappointment and the discomfort of that and say, maybe there's a different way. Maybe there's a different behaviors that I can choose. There are different choices I can make. And that point of decision is probably the most key, because choosing to change is intuitively built on grace. Going back into shame creates more law, more demand, more expectations, more failures, and more failures turn into I am just more of a failure. So the first one has to be discomfort. In a lot of cases in our environment and in our culture, this is avoided at all costs. At all costs. Which tells you something about why people stay in stained glass. Because the discomfort is pathologized. The discomfort is an indication there is something wrong. Not all the time. No, if I'm in a balcony and I fall off and I experience discomfort, yeah, that's bad. That's destructive, okay? But there is also an internal dissatisfaction that is uncomfortable, and we should pay attention, because I would suggest to you that the Holy Spirit is poking in just hard enough to get your attention. So there's discomfort. The second one is self-reflection. One of the reasons, and a lot of you guys have heard me say this before, but one of the reasons that I challenge you, probably more than most, to do this in my classes is because if I can look at the contours and landscape of my heart, I will begin to know it. I can't know something I won't look at. The wonder of the stained glass is we get so invested in the appearance we make that we pay absolutely no attention to the contours and the landscape of our heart. That's the one not the one, but one of the marching orders we've been given from Proverbs. Guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. If you don't take care of that well, all the downstream behaviors, you can do everything you want about them. It won't matter because the well's contaminated. As hard as it is to look with some measure of brutal honesty, it's essential to begin to integrate, to begin to become integrated people, pure glass people. The last one is feedback from safe people. I have to invite people to give me feedback, to let me know my impact on them. But it's got to be from safe people. I go to somebody who's a critic, and this is not going to be helpful at all. But if I can find and develop the kind of relationships that have safe people in them, then when I say, how did that come across? Or how did I come across? Or how do you see me? Or let's go to the other question from the safe people stuff. What do I do that pushes you away? And what do I do that draws you to me? It's inviting feedback. The thing I want you to keep in mind is we were designed for feedback. I can say that because all you have to do is look at your nervous system. The whole thing is built on feedback. You take one modality away and we're in trouble. You douse your hand in a very hot, bowl of water, and you don't have feedback, you're going to scald your skin. Somehow we've gotten the notion that we don't need that in the emotional realm or spiritual realm. We need the feedback, but we need it from people that are as devoted to our growth as they are to their own. And I think that's part of the definition of safe people. Now, there are a lot of people who want to say they're devoted to our growth, and they're still critics because they're not devoted to their own. So, what we have to do is allow this fire of crisis. Because what melts lead? Fire. What melts glass? Fire. There has to be some crisis that changes the rules of how I do things. And usually it's really hot. And it creates a lot of discomfort. So, we've got to allow it to melt the power of shame and begin to bring about more and more pure glass. The thing you have to keep in mind is that if we've been all of this time developing this stained glass, and now I lean in on this crisis and let fire begin to develop or melt the shame and all the other things, I'm forever, remember this, lifelong moving between pure glass and less pure. Maybe not stained glass, but less pure. We can revert to our old ways very, very easily. But what it means then is I've got to evaluate my core values and attitudes and beliefs about myself, about my relationships, and about God. There are a lot of people that in their spiritual journey go through something that oftentimes is referred to as the wall. It is very disorienting, and it ends up being exactly this reevaluation. Who I am versus who I have cast myself to be. And somehow I have to reestablish my core responsibility to develop the kind of blinds necessary to guard my heart and open that glass only to those who are trustworthy enough to handle what they see behind it. Which also means I'm the guardian of the blind. Not everybody is entitled to know what's behind that blind. Not everybody is. I don't care what they say. All you have to do is look at their behavior to figure out whether or not they're trustworthy enough. Yeah, Cam.
So, what's the difference between like having blinds, putting your blinds up, and having stained glass? Like I understand the difference. Letting people in, but
Well, what's the difference between stained glass and a blind?
I mean I understand that the blinds can be open,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like your stained glass up can the way be open
How?
to some safe people.
Stained glass, unless I break it, I'm not going. There are people, whether there's safe people outside or not, they're not going to see in. The difference is that I have the power to adjust how much somebody sees. With stained glass, I will never do that. I mean, you can create a variety of conditions to say that stained glass accomplishes the same thing, but I can't get rid of stained glass real easy. But I can move a blind pretty easily because I have the power to do that. And I've been given that power to do that. So the thing to keep in mind about the stained glass is it is not only something in terms of appearance management, but it is also a strategy for handling life. And it shows everything about that up there in terms of how I see myself, how I see others, and how I see God. So the point of this imagery of using a blind is the power I have to choose who gets to see through the glass and who doesn't. Because I'm not going to be transparent to everybody. I really shouldn't be transparent to everybody. Yeah.
I feel like the process of moving towards that is ownership.
It is. It is. I mean, when I said earlier, at some point they forget that the stained glass is not them, is a giving over of ownership to the glass instead of themselves. So absolutely, ownership is exploring my own heart and taking responsibility for it. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So the continuing part of this, all right, and what I'm trying to describe is this process of moving from the stained glass to pure glass, or at least glass that can be seen through. And this is where we cross over into the things that Brené Brown talked about with critical awareness, is I have to be able to, and this is really easier said than done, I have to be able to develop the ability to have critical awareness about the issues I have, unique to me, without shame. Yeah.
In bookshelves, it's about like the balance between being so invested in what people think and then not caring at all, because you said like we need feedback, but the issue that we were talking about with adolescents is we care so much about feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess how do we find that balance? Or how have you found that balance?
Well, but I think that's a conversation about boundaries, because adolescence is kind of a reworking of boundaries. They start with none, and so let's go all the way back into time. Everybody defines me. I am what everybody says I am. 2, I take increasing level of ownership of me, and then I can either play their game and do the appearance management thing, or I can begin to own more and more of myself. So I think that's where the boundaries piece comes in. The problem is boundaries end up being a little abstract for most adolescents. So you have to find ways to communicate that a little differently. And in a lot of cases, kids that grow up in families and so forth that have boundaries, they intuitively understand when things are getting crossed. So yeah, I think indeed that's very much a part of that developmental piece that we're talking about here. These 4 dimensions, though, you guys that are in family psych and have been through the human sexuality book as well, these 4 dimensions are key in terms of having this understanding. And we're going to unpack these later in terms of, because from here on out, we're turning a corner. Because we've set the stage of talking about boundaries and safe people and the scandal of grace and the comfort of shame and all the things that lead into it. And then we land right in the middle of the stained glass self idea. And from here on out, the question has to be answered, now what? And understanding covenant is moving from seeing people as objects to persons. And grace, we're always spending our time talking about and looking at that and creating a space to learn and to grow and to change in intimacy and empowerment. So, choosing the dignity of personhood over objectification. Just remember, though, and you guys that were in my human sexuality class, this will ring a bell. When I talk about objectification, I'm not talking about lust. I'm talking about seeing people as a means to an end rather than a person of value. That's living covenantally with people. I don't have to be in a marriage relationship to live covenantally. It's a lot more inconvenient. It's very inconvenient because we are very accustomed to dealing with each other on the basis of trades and on the basis of quid pro quo, this for that. Grace is accepting the gift that's offered to us to live lives of freedom and trust. The thing that I will say on this and learn, it takes a life to learn, is that love flourishes in freedom. Love flourishes in freedom. The minute you take freedom away, it's not love anymore. It's the objectification of the other for my ends. Intimacy is allowing ourselves to be known and pursue knowing others based on empathy and compassion. The only way that I'm going to develop empathy is being able to know myself enough to hear the resonating chords of the emotional stuff that's going on in somebody else. But if I'm not going to do that, then it will be an academic enterprise, it will be an intellectual one, it won't be a real one. And empowerment is the commitment to boundaries and safe people and looking for ways to edify and build up others to join us in this journey of owning their own hearts. There are lots of things that we can do out of just those 4 dimensions to impact the people around us. And a lot of times it boils down to one phrase, me too. Because I think we can safely say that our Savior was a man full of grace and truth. We got that, right? But the image of Jesus that's presented to us in Scripture is so unique that we have no idea because we've grown so accustomed to it. We're following a Savior that is so unique in all of the world religions. It is the only one where God says to the people he comes to save, me too. It's the only one. And if that's good enough for him, I would suspect that's probably good enough for us. But it's contained entirely in grace and in covenant. Jesus said that and did that and went through being born as a human in a back stall at a hotel that nobody wanted to go to, stinking of manure and everything else that goes with it, and being an ostracized kid in the community because he was born out of wedlock. And probably forever thereafter he was known that way, and we see images of it in Scripture. Where who is this? This is the carpenter's son. What does he know? Worse yet, he's not only a carpenter's son, he was born out of wedlock. Did you know? He's the bastard child of Joseph. He is not the legitimate child of Joseph. So when we start to believe and see in ourselves that we're throwaway, that we don't belong anywhere, we've got a Savior that says, yeah, me too. So how do we pursue integration? One way that I define integration is WYSIWYG. All of your computer programs, your desktops on your computers all function according to this. What you see is what you get. One way to see this is becoming people who are courageous enough to be known. Not to manage, just to be known. And there are risks, obviously. But there are also benefits in the sense that the more I am willing to be known, the more I am able to own me. Why do I share things? Why do I allow people to know me? It's twofold. One, I want that relationship with somebody else. But the other part of it is if I don't say it, I can't own it. In a lot of ways, in a lot of cases. If it stays locked up in my head, it's not really real. So we begin to engage in Brene Brown's idea that she proposed, the idea of ordinary courage in everyday life. It means that instead of being stained glass, it means being glass that has all of the arenas of my life revolving and impacted by the core of my values, the core of my beliefs, the core of my attitudes. And it's an interchange in a lot of ways, but every area is not dictated to by certain rules of engagement, certain behaviors, certain values, etc. But it's informed by all that goes along with it. So we develop a circle of safe people, friends who care as much about my growth as their own. What does that mean? Usually it doesn't mean applauding for when I do everything right. It means having the courage to tell me when I'm doing something that is hurtful or impacting them. That's courage from a friend. Not a critic friend. That's not courage. That's diversion. But the other part of this is a lifelong kind of pursuit of resisting shame-based self and other evaluations. And a lot of you have already recognized in your interactions with other people and other things in your life and going through school and all the things that you have been doing, even, we're at week 8. And all the things that have happened just in the last 8 weeks. And recognize how much shame lurks at the doorway all the time. It frames and defines all things about us. And so we have to find some way to place ourselves in the kind of community that will allow us to have the grace to look at things and wrestle with the shame and then move into the grace that's offered to say, okay, I can change. I can do this different. Not easily. It's really hard. And ultimately, that's exactly why I forced y'all into groups. And that's a possibility with no risk. You're not going to get much out of it other than more self-protection and safety. So, there you have it. I don't know where it's going to go or how it's going to be, but that's what it is. So, questions, reactions. Great, I've stunned them into silence. Yes, sir.
I guess my a lot of what I'm thinking is like how do you empower
Well, the question, did you guys hear that question? The question is how do you empower other people to engage in their own integration? And yeah, it is. It's definitely a boundary question, or issue, if you will. I think a lot of it is the risk of talking about your own and giving them the freedom to be where they are. And in a lot of cases, there's something, I think, somewhat magnetic about seeing somebody that is free enough to actually do the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Now, that doesn't guarantee outcome. It doesn't. But it does invite more people onto the journey. And that's all we can do, ultimately. And that's an important part of the process, I think, of owning our own journey, is just talking about it. We do a lot of things, but we don't give people around us the context for why we do them. And that's what the kind of the story on the way kind of thing is with this. So, any other questions? Yeah, Cam.
I understand like compartments, how we put on almost be like a different person, different groups and stuff. But how like I feel like sometimes I do that to relate to certain people a certain way. Is that like just different from compartment?
Compartments are a lot more static than relating to somebody. Relating to somebody is more of a strategy for connecting. Compartments are not about connecting. They're about controlling. So that's the biggest difference between those two things. So, anything else? Okay. Have fun while you're young. You're a long time old. See you later.